Do you believe that sometimes the flap of a ragged canvas tent can open straight into the darkest past a man has tried to bury for years that night? With the wind tearing through the canyon like it wanted to rip the earth apart. A strange hand pulled back the flap of Elias Ward's shelter. No voice, no plea, just a trembling figure stepping inside, caught in the faint glow of dying coals. And from that moment on, the solitude Elias once wore like armor suddenly turned into a question: would the past ever truly leave him alone? Before we ride deeper into this tale, let me pause a second. If that opening made your pulse quicken, if you've ever felt that nighttime silence can be more dangerous than gunfire, tap that like button to help keep these Western stories alive. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Is it a quiet porch in the country, or a small room in the heart of the city? I promise you this: stay with me until the end. And you won't just see a storm outside, you'll feel the storm that lives inside a lonely man's chest. That night, the wind roared through the canyon like wild beasts finally slipped from their chains. It snapped the canvas, rattled the poles, sent sparks flying from the coals. Elias Ward sat hunched against the back post, brim low over his eyes, one hand resting lightly on the worn stock of his Henry rifle. No one could see him, and he wanted it that way. 4 years out of the army, he had learned to live in darkness, to breathe smoke, to survive on rabbit snares and bitter coffee. What weighed him down wasn't hunger, it was memory. People say war ends when the shooting stops. For Elias, it never did. Every night he heard the burning villages again, the screams that cut off into silence. The orders barked cold as steel. He'd stood there, pretending not to watch, pretending he wasn't part of it. To escape, he chose this life alone, nameless, with no one to answer to but the coyotes and the cold. But solitude is never absolute. Some nights, the land itself tests a man by setting something unexpected in his path. When the flap stirred differently this time, Elias's eyes snapped open. Wind, maybe. But there was breath too fast, uneven, trying to hide. His hand lifted the rifle, not cocked, but ready. And then the figure appeared. First came her legs thin, scratched, raw with dust. Then the blanket burned at one edge, hanging crooked. No real protection at all. Her hair was black, tangled with sweat. A young face, hollow with exhaustion. Eyes wide, but dry, as if she'd already cried herself empty. She was Apache. She stepped inside without a word, without asking, without denying. Elias didn't lower the rifle. Years of soldiering taught him one truth: anyone who stumbled into a soldier's camp carried reasons too heavy to name. Maybe hunted. Maybe bait. The air inside the tent grew thick enough to choke. Outside, the wind shrieked. Inside, two strangers held each other in silence, both measuring the other. She trembled but didn't retreat. Her eyes said it all: she knew she could be hurt. But she had no other place left to go. And Elias, hard as iron, jaw set like stone, felt something stir in his chest he hadn't let himself feel in years. Not pity exactly, but something close. That night, Elias's fortress of solitude cracked for the first time. He sat against the post. She sat curled on the far side, both faces caught in the dying firelight. No words passed, only the heavy breathing of people who had both survived too much. It wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the tense space between two lives colliding by accident, yet bound to change each other. And that was the beginning. The beginning of a tense night, the beginning of a fragile tether, and the beginning of a question Elias dared not speak. Could he ever step out of the shadow of war, or would he have to face it in the exhausted eyes of an Apache girl? An old man of the West once said, "The cold outside never kills as quick as the cold inside a man's chest." That night, Elias Ward learned the truth of those words. after the first suffocating moment. He lowered the rifle slowly, not putting it down, just letting the barrel lean toward the dirt. Years of frontier living had taught him never to act in haste. Trust was a luxury, but turning away someone about to collapse in front of him would mean carving away what little humanity he had left. He reached into the corner of the tent and pulled out a spare blanket, thin, ragged, and carrying the smell of smoke. He held it out, but didn't step closer. The Apache girl stood frozen, trembling, eyes like a deer caught in a snare too tired to flee, yet ready to bite if he reached too far. In the end, Elias dropped the blanket on the ground between them, as if to say, "Take it if you want. I won't force it." She bent to pick it up, knees buckling slightly from exhaustion. When she wrapped the extra layer around her shoulders, she didn't thank him, only released a faint breath more than fatigue, less than relief. Outside, the fire had nearly gone out. Elias pushed himself up, stepped into the wind, and crouched low to coax the embers back to life. The canyon gusts shrieked like whistles through stone, but he worked patiently, feeding the glow with dry sticks until it flared again. In that light, her face showed clearer bronzed skin, cuts across her arms, deep eyes that looked older than her years. He set a tin cup over the fire and poured in the bitter black liquid he still called coffee. When it steamed, he offered it across. She hesitated, eyes flicking once toward the Henry resting within his reach, then stretched out both hands to take it. The heat made her shake harder, but she drank every drop. She said nothing. Neither did he. Elias leaned back against the post again, hat brim shadowing his eyes. He watched her, not like a man sizing up a prize, but like an old wolf guarding his den. She watched him too, blinking now and then, as if to avoid his gaze but refusing to look away completely. That silence between them felt like a wire stretched over a canyon. One wrong move and it would snap, sending both into the void. And yet, instead of retreating, both stayed seated, letting the firelight throw their uneasy shadows onto the canvas walls. Inside Elias, old memories stirred those nights in uniform, those same Apache eyes he'd seen across the flames of burning villages. He gripped the rifle stock hard, then loosened it again. Not tonight, he told himself. Enough blood had been spilled. Tonight was only wind and two lonely souls sharing space. She placed the empty cup on the dirt, drew her knees up under the blanket. She didn't turn her back on him a surprise. Someone like her, used to danger, knew better than to expose her spine to a stranger. Instead, she sat at an angle, half facing him, half guarding herself, as if to admit, for this night at least, we share the same fire. Time dragged, the fire burned down, then back up as Elias fed it. Neither slept. When the wind slammed the canvas, she jolted, hand slipping beneath the blanket. He knew there was a knife there. He didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed it. Good, he thought. Someone who still clings to a blade hasn't given up entirely. That night, suspicion never left, but it changed. It no longer felt like the readiness of two enemies about to strike. It was the taut air of two spirits cornered into the same space, forced to share warmth while fearing the burn. Elias Ward understood clearly this silence was not trust. Not yet. It was only the beginning, a small ember in the ashes, fragile, easily snuffed out. But for a man who had lived so long with nothing but emptiness, that ember was enough to remind him he wasn't completely hollow anymore. There are mornings in the West when the sun doesn't so much rise as it leaks a pale streak of light through heavy mist. The next day was one of those mornings. Elias Ward was up early, out of habit carved from years of soldiering, checking the traps he had set the day before. He figured he'd be alone. He wasn't. Behind him came the crunch of gravel light steps. Steady. The Apache girl Nayeli was following. She said nothing, kept a few paces back, eyes fixed on every move he made. When Elias crouched to reset a snare that had come up empty, she knelt too, watching. At the third trap, the wire held a rabbit. Before Elias reached down, Nayeli gestured for his knife. He hesitated, then offered it handle first. Her hand was small but tough, scarred in places. She knew what she was doing. In a handful of quick, practiced motions, she bled, skinned, and wrapped the rabbit in a strip of cloth. Nothing wasted. When she handed the knife back, her eyes met his squarely for the first time. No thanks. No fear, just a look that said, "I can survive on my own. Don't mistake me for helpless." Elias gave a small nod, and that was enough. Back at camp, Nayeli knelt at the fire pit, striking sparks, coaxing flame from a bundle of dry twigs she had pulled from her own pouch. No one told her what to do. She didn't ask. Elias sat nearby, patching a tear in his coat, until the needle snapped in his hand. He muttered a curse under his breath, ready to toss the cloth aside, without a word. Nayeli took the coat from him, drew a thin bone needle from the pouch at her hip, threaded it, and stitched in even, precise lines. Elias watched for a moment, then let her be. If she wanted to do it, let her. That night, they ate rabbit with a handful of wild onions. No talk, just the snap and pop of fire. Elias noticed she never touched his rifle, never tested his boundaries. He, in turn, never pressed her with questions about where she came from. Out here, silence could be its own form of respect, but before the fire died, while the canyon wind howled against the canvas walls, Nayeli spoke at last. Her voice was rough, uncertain, as if she feared even asking, "Why? Why didn't you touch me that first night?" Elias looked up. The words hung in the dim tent like a knife. He knew what she meant. In this country, too many women couldn't step into a man's shelter without paying a cost. His jaw tightened. His hand brushed the rifle, then let go. He didn't flinch from her eyes, but he didn't invade her space either. His voice was steady. "Plain. Because you didn't want me to. I could see that clear enough." Nayeli stayed still, staring hard at him as if weighing whether he spoke truth or wore another mask. But when the flames cast his weathered face into long shadows, she finally dipped her head, not in surrender, not in weakness, just in quiet recognition that her boundary had been honored. At least this once. That night she lay down, still wrapped in both blankets, but not with her back turned. She angled herself, half facing him. The space between them was still there, but it no longer felt like a blade's edge. It felt softer, like a thin stream running through dry rock, not enough to drink, but proof that life hadn't vanished completely. Elias didn't sleep right away. He lay there, listening to the wind hammer the tent, and realized the silence between them had changed. Once, silence meant emptiness. Now it meant two strangers holding their ground, respecting the fragile line neither dared to cross. And for the first time in years, Elias thought maybe respect is the only thing left that can grow into trust. Once war has burned everything else away. In the West, there are evenings when the sky turns gray like an old blanket thrown across the valley. The wind never seemed to stop. But that night, by the fire, the silence between Elias and Nayeli no longer carried the same weight it had before. Instead, it felt like waiting to see if either one of them would find the courage to finally speak what was buried inside. Nayeli sat close to the flames, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, her hands rubbing together for warmth. Elias honed his knife on a flat stone, each scrape steady, the sound blending with the wind outside. Neither rushed to speak. At last, it was Nayeli who broke the quiet. "My people. They said I brought misfortune." Her voice was low, eyes fixed on the fire. "After the child died of sickness. They said it spread because I stayed." They blamed me for everything, the horses running off, the empty traps, the hailstorms. They said it all came from me. Elias stopped. The blade froze halfway through a stroke. He didn't interrupt, only listened. They left me on the dry hills. No shoes, no food. They took my brother Miguel. Her voice caught, thinning to a whisper. He's only 7. They said they'd give him to the mission near the trading post. They said he'd be fed, taught to pray, and he'd be better off without me. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, the story dragging him back into old memories. He had seen too many lines of children herded into churchyards, heads shorn, bodies wrapped in loose cotton, their eyes empty. They didn't look like themselves anymore, only shadows shaped by another man's hand. He looked at Nayeli, this time, not with suspicion, but with the need to truly see her grief. And he realized then that while she was still young, her eyes carried more years than his own, because she had borne the weight of being cast aside by her own blood. "What's the boy's name?" Elias asked, his voice gravel rough. "Miguel. You know for certain where he is?" She shook her head, dark strands falling to cover half her face. "Only heard about a white-walled church near the post. I don't know for sure." The fire snapped softly, throwing their shadows against the canvas. Elias tightened his hand around the knife hilt, then set it aside. His back pressed against the tent pole, but his eyes reached farther than the flames, as if seeing the road ahead. "You want to find him?" Nayeli lifted her gaze, trembling but steady. "It's the only thing I have left to search for. If he's alive, I have to take him. If not—" She stopped, clutching the edge of the blanket. Elias drew a long breath, chest heavy. In his mind, the war rose again, burning homes, scattered children, soldiers like himself standing frozen, watching but never helping. He had survived by staying silent. But tonight, silence was no longer an option. "Tomorrow," Elias said, his voice firm, "we move out. I've passed that trading post. I know the quickest way." Nayeli's eyes widened. She didn't ask why. She only stared at him, searching to be sure she heard right. Her look was no longer the wary glance of a stranger. It was the look of someone given back a fragment of hope. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. Elias tilted his head, the corner of his mouth twitching with something close to a smile. "Maybe I owe it to myself, for all the times I stood still when I should have done something." She didn't answer. She turned back to the fire, eyes glinting whether from smoke or tears. Elias couldn't tell, but for the first time, her shoulders dropped, no longer drawn tight with fear. It was as if the weight she carried had finally shifted, no longer hers alone. That night, Elias barely slept, but unlike the nights before, the old ghosts didn't gnaw at him alone. Beside him, Nayeli's faint breathing was a reminder that he had chosen differently not to turn away, not to leave someone behind. It was a small choice, maybe, but out here in this unforgiving country, it was enough to change the fate of them both. And maybe, deep down, he began to realize redemption wasn't found in prayer. It was found in walking beside someone when they had no one else left. The road to the trading post and the mission was no easy trail. Red earth clung to their boots in heavy mud after the rain. Jagged stone cut across the path, and the early winter wind whipped their faces like a leather lash. Elias walked ahead, one hand on the reins, eyes sweeping the ridges the way a man does when he expects trouble at any moment. Nayeli followed in silence, never complaining, only matching his stride. Neither spoke, but their shared determination grew with each mile, both of them knowing this journey would decide Miguel's fate. By midday on the 3rd day, the whitewashed walls of the mission rose from the barren land, the bell tower jutting up like it didn't belong there. The iron bell tolled, its sound echoing across the canyon. In the yard, children ran in lines, heads shaved, cotton clothes hanging loose. A young priest in a black cassock stood by the well, speaking smoothly to a trader. His smile looked polished, but cold. Elias stepped into the yard, boots slow and steady. The Henry rifle lay slung across his shoulder, not raised, but plain enough for everyone to see. The children scattered. The wind whistled against the tiles. The priest turned, his eyes sharp, his voice smooth as oil. "Good day, friend. How may I help you?" Elias didn't waste words. "I'm looking for a boy. Apache. Name's Miguel." "About 7. They brought him here. For a flicker." The priest's face changed, then smoothed into another smile. "We take in many orphans. I'll need to check the records." Nayeli stepped forward, silent, holding out a small bone charm carved with the mark of a hawk. Miguel's token. The priest's expression faltered, then recovered. "Ah, yes. That one. He's here." Elias's jaw tightened. His voice dropped low. "Bring him out." The priest hesitated. "Perhaps we should discuss this in my office." Elias cut him off, his tone flat as steel. "Here. Now." The mission yard froze. After a long pause, the priest waved to a woman. Moments later, she let out a thin boy, head cropped short, clothes clean but hanging loose on his frame. When his dark eyes lifted, Nayeli's breath caught. It was Miguel. The boy froze, then broke into a run. Nayeli fell to her knees, arms open, clutching him to her chest. Tears slipped down her face without sound. Miguel sobbed quietly, small hands gripping his sister as if afraid she might vanish again. Elias turned away, letting them have their moment. But the priest's cough cut the air. "You cannot simply take him. There are papers, custody rules. The boy belongs to the church." Elias turned back, his eyes narrowing. From his coat he drew out a folded document. The ink seal of the Southern District Army, still legible. Order from the quartermaster. Authorizes me to relocate any tribal youth under protection. Is that official enough? The priest's hand shook as he read. It was real. He handed it back, lips tight. "Then he is your responsibility now. If the boy loses his way, the blame lies with you." "Not with you," Elias answered, slipping the paper away. That was the end of it. He adjusted the rifle on his shoulder and walked for the gate. Nayeli rose with Miguel in her arms, following close. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, the sound of children's voices fading back into the courtyard. For Elias, only one thing mattered. The boy was out. The three of them walked down the dirt road, dust rising around their boots. Miguel clung to his sister's neck, wide eyes fixed on Elias. He said nothing, just watched the man's back, measuring him half doubt, half hope. Elias didn't turn, but he felt the weight of that gaze. That night they camped by a dry creek bed. Elias fed more wood to the fire while Nayeli held Miguel close, whispering in her native tongue, voice trembling with comfort and promise. Elias didn't know the words, but he knew the feeling protecting something small from the reach of unseen hands. In the firelight, his eyes softened. He knew the choice he had made bound him to a road he couldn't walk back from, but it was a road worth walking. For the Apache girl, for the boy, and maybe, at long last, for himself. Their first night after leaving the mission, the three of them found a flat patch of ground near a dry creek bed to make camp. No whitewashed walls, no bell ringing, only the hiss of wind through bare branches and a sky scattered thick with stars. Elias rigged a shelter from an old canvas, tied to the mule's flank and weighted with stones. The fire he built wasn't bright, but it was enough to push back the dark and the chill. Miguel sat close to his sister, wide-eyed at everything. A boy who had known walls and forced prayers, now staring at the open wild with both fear and wonder. Nayeli knelt, wiping the mud from his feet, humming a tune older than either Elias or the mission itself. Elias sat opposite, not intruding, just watching his gaze. For once, held something gentler than suspicion. After they ate a thin stew of beans, Miguel curled under a blanket and drifted into sleep, his breathing steady as the night wind. The fire crackled, sparks rising. Elias and Nayeli sat in the hush until she finally spoke. "I was 8 when soldiers burned our storehouse," she said, voice flat, eyes on the flames. "A man ran back inside for a sack of corn. They shot him down. I hid behind a woodpile. I saw it all. I didn't make a sound." Her words fell like stones into the silence. Elias's hand pressed against the worn stock of his rifle, his jaw set. He didn't answer right away. Then his voice came rough, almost gravel. Not the same place. But I was there too, standing in line, watching, doing nothing. Nayeli lifted her eyes. There was no accusation in them. No shock, only recognition. She gave a small nod. "I knew. You didn't have to say it. I already knew." The truth of it lay bare between them. Their pasts had crossed in fire and silence. And somehow, that truth lessened the distance, not widened it. The firelight flickered across Elias's weathered face. He raised his eyes to hers, voice heavy but plain. "I can't undo what's been done, but from here on, I won't let it happen again. Not to you, not to the boy." For the first time, her gaze softened. A fragile spark of trust showed there, faint, but real. She dipped her head, drawing the blanket tighter. "Then we go together," she whispered. "No more alone." That night they didn't lie, pressed close. But they didn't turn their backs either. Nayeli lay near the fire, Elias opposite, and Miguel in between. The boy's steady breathing became a bridge between them, in that stillness. Elias closed his eyes without the old war flames rising to burn him. All he heard was the snap of wood and the living breaths beside him. The next day, they moved as if they had done it forever. Elias cut branches, rigging a rack to dry meat. Nayeli searched the brush for wild greens and herbs. Miguel gathered kindling, learning from his sister's hands how to coax sparks into flame. No orders, no master and servant. Just 3 people, each with a part, working side by side. By evening, Elias watched Nayeli with needle and thread, patching Miguel's torn sleeve with patient hands. When she caught him looking, she said quietly, "You saved him. But raising him, we have to do that together." Elias nodded once. No vow was needed. Inside him, something new stirred. It felt like setting a stone into the earth, knowing it was the first piece of something solid. Trust wasn't a wall yet, but it was enough to throw a shadow where all had been empty. That second night, when the canyon wind rose, Nayeli shifted closer to his side, not touching, only near enough for warmth. Elias didn't move away. He let the closeness stand as its own sign that the boundary between them was no longer a wall, but a cord tying 3 lives together. And so, from careful steps and fragile words, trust began to take root. Elias Ward, who had lived like a ghost since the war, now had reason to face forward a brave Apache woman, a boy who needed shelter, and a small camp in the wild where he was no longer alone. As the days of wandering stretched into weeks, Elias remembered a place he'd once passed years ago, an old cavalry line station, long abandoned after the patrols faded out. What remained was a stone foundation, a few sagging log walls, and a clearing pressed against the rock face. He led Nayeli and Miguel there one late afternoon, the sun slipping low, mist crawling over the distant ridges. From the rise above, Elias pointed. "There. If we put in the work, it could be a home." Nayeli narrowed her eyes, taking in the ruin, rotted beams, a roof half collapsed, weeds choking the entry. But instead of discouragement, she gave a small nod. If there's stone and wood, I can build a hearth, and this place will be ours." They began at dawn. Elias cut posts and lashed a frame. Nayeli kept the fire and smoked strips of meat. Miguel scurried about, piling rocks into a ring. Few words passed between them, only the sound of an axe in timber, the flap of canvas in the wind, and sometimes the boys' laughter slipping into the air. That night, the three of them sat against the first upright wall. The wind pushed through the cracks. Firelight flickered. Nayeli bent over a scrap of cloth, sewing a tear in Elias's coat with her bone needle. Her fingers moved quick and neat, more patient than his own. Elias watched. Uneasy, he wasn't used to being cared for. When he reached to take the coat back, she held it a moment longer. Her dark eyes, caught in the fire's glow, looked as though they wanted to ask something but weren't sure how. At last, she handed it over. Elias cleared his throat. "I'm not used to someone tending to me." Her cheeks flushed faintly. "I'm not used to letting anyone close. But—" She twisted the edge of her blanket in her hands. "You respected me. That first night, every night, I haven't forgotten." The air went still, not heavy but uncertain, like both had stepped onto ground too soft to trust. Elias meant to speak, but the words caught in his chest. All he managed was a slow nod, his eyes turning back to the flames. Miguel was already asleep near the fire, breathing deep, in the quiet. Nayeli shifted closer. Her shoulder brushed his elbow. It was a small touch, but for someone who had lived on guard so long, it felt like a declaration. Elias stiffened at first, then let it be. "You don't have to promise me anything," she said softly, her face warming in the firelight. "I just want you to know, if I stay, it's because I choose to. No one is forcing me." Her words trembled but held steady. Elias turned, meeting her eyes. They no longer held only caution, they carried a giving of trust, something he hadn't expected to ever be offered again. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to shorten the space. His reply was rough, plain. "If you choose, then I'll be here. I won't walk away." They sat without speaking after that, but it wasn't the old emptiness. That night, Nayeli leaned just close enough that her hair brushed his shoulder. Elias didn't pull back. In the firelight, the silence between them spoke clearer than words that something had been acknowledged. At dawn they worked again. Elias drove posts until his shirt clung wet to his back. Nayeli carried water and packed moss into the seams. Miguel filled the hearthstones with his small hands, proud of every one. Three people no longer scattered souls, now moved like a single rhythm, as if they had always known how to share the load. By evening, when the wall finally stood, Elias stepped back. The cabin wasn't whole, but it held against the wind. He turned to find Nayeli watching him. Her dark eyes glowed with a light that was equal parts pride and something softer, her cheeks touched by a faint red. In that moment, they both understood the shyness between them was no barrier. It was its own kind of promise that they weren't just building shelter, but a bond shaped by choice, equal and unforced, one they had both agreed to carry forward. Winter in the West doesn't come with one sudden storm. It creeps in, slow and steady, like a cold hand laying claim to the land. First it's just heavy morning fog, then a thin crust of ice on the water, and finally snow blanketing the valley white. Yet in the little cabin tucked against the ridge, fire still burned. Smoke curled steady from the chimney, and the sound of a child's laughter softened what once had been silence. Elias stood in the doorway one morning, watching frost cling white to the fence they'd built. His breath clouded in the bitter air, but inside him there was a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Behind him, inside the cabin, Nayeli stirred the fire while Miguel circled it with wide eyes, holding out his small hands like the flames were some miracle. The house wasn't perfect. The boards didn't line flush. The door still rattled, and the roof sometimes groaned against the wind. But it stood. It held through the storm, and it stood as proof of the labor and patience of 3 people who had bound their lives together in the wild. That evening, when the chores had quieted, Elias sat at the rough-hewn table carving into a strip of hide. His knife moved slow, deliberate, the lamplight flickering across his focused face. Miguel crept closer, eyes shining. "What are you making?" Elias didn't answer at once. When the last cut was done, he turned the leather over. 3 names. Cut deep and sure: Nayeli Miguel. Ward. Nayeli, who had been sewing by the fire, froze. She set her needle aside and stepped closer. Her fingers traced the rough letters, her dark eyes glistening in the glow. "Ward. You mean—" Elias gave a small nod, his voice low but certain. "My name doesn't carry much, but if it marks a home, then it belongs to the 3 of us." Miguel's face lit, chest puffing with pride. "Then, I'm Ward too." Elias laid a hand on his head. "That's right. Boy, from now on, you belong here, to us." In that instant, the cabin changed. It was no longer only a shelter. It was home with a name, with a family. Later that night, after Miguel had fallen asleep, Nayeli sat beside Elias, the fire dying down to coals. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft but steady. "I never thought someone like me, cast out, unwanted, would ever be called family. But you gave me that." Elias drew her close, eyes fixed on the ember glow. "You and the boy gave me more. Gave me a reason to stop running, to build, not to destroy." Outside, the wind still cut across the ridge, but in that cabin, the air felt calm. Their silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was full. The days that followed carried a rhythm. Each morning, Elias split logs. Miguel scampered behind him gathering sticks. Nayeli boiled broth from wild roots. Evenings, they sat by the fire and spoke of their pasts, not to hide them, but to lay them down, piece by piece, until they became stories instead of scars. Together, they turned survival into living. And now, friends, as you listen, perhaps you feel it too, the warmth that lingers in this cabin, far beyond the storm outside. A soldier who once lived haunted, a woman once cast aside, and a boy who nearly lost his childhood. They forged something that neither war, nor exile, nor winter could take away. A family, a name, a fire that belongs to them. If you believe Elias has earned his place in this world, if you see Nayeli and Miguel finding what was once denied to them, let them know. Leave your support. Remind them and remind us that no matter the past, anyone can choose to build a home out of trust and courage. And maybe the question now is what comes next when spring breaks through the snow. Should Elias plant seed and turn this cabin into a small ranch? Should they open their doors to others wandering alone? Just as Elias once opened his tent to Nayeli, or should they simply hold tight to what they've built, guarding it like the heartbeat it has become? Whatever the answer, one truth stands firm: Elias Ward is no longer a ghost wandering in storm and silence. He is a cornerstone for 2 lives, and they are the same for him. Beyond the cabin walls, winter still pressed hard against the mountains, but within, the fire burned steady. A fire of family, a fire of belonging. And if we, those of us listening, carry their story forward, that fire will never die.